Okay, and everything moved around. All right, cool. That's looking pretty good. Okay. So good afternoon, morning, evening, whatever it is, wherever you're at. I'm Brent, a amateur world builder, writing educator, and I forget what else I say usually about there. An author. Yes, that thing too. Forgot about that. There are those books. You can find me as werewolf-dr. on Threads, Instagram _dr. I keep forgetting that. On Threads, Instagram, Patreon, Ko-Fi, and YouTube, as well as here. And as werewolf-dr on Bluesky. That's what that thing's called. Cool. I'm going to go ahead and actually throw links in the chat real quick. And I will say hello to the couple who just popped in. I don't like this, having that part there. Okay, cool. Excellent. So, yes, we are, what? Oh, geez, 8 days away from holiday. Okay, fun. So hope everything is going well for everybody who happens to be there in chat or elsewhere. Things are looking good for in terms of whatever plans happen to be for the next month or so, or next half month, whatever it is. I am on break right now, so I have no clue what day it is most of the time. So today I was thinking, or this week, I was thinking I would kind of look through, talk about, work with some ideas I'd been kind of having for a while, but haven't really done much with. I had done some blog posts years upon years ago regarding, and let's angle that a little bit differently there. Sorry, just moving my camera around, figuring out where I want to put it. Exactly. So some stuff I had talked about years ago in some blog posts, and then that kind of went away. I was thinking about making it into a book at some point in time, but then other things took priority in terms of writing, in terms of book stuff, and then this kind of became to the side, and I was thinking about coming back to it, and it's kind of can be kind of a rough subject, rough topic, so I wasn't really sure how exactly I wanted to approach it, looking into a book form, that sort of thing. And that is different races, lineages, heritages, etc., and their use, particularly in the fantasy genre, whether that be gaming or writing or world building in general. Get rid of that stupid thing. I hate. Don't want to see the updates. So I also get rid of this stuff that I don't need. Clear up my desktop a little bit. Awesome. That makes things a little more organized. Cool. So there's obviously been a lot of digital and real ink spilled over the question of whether races, species, heritages, lineage, whatever you want to call it. For simplicity's sake, I will just say pick one of them. Randomly pick one. Let's say heritages in fantasy and TTRPGs for quite a long time. Before talking about things in this regard, I will start off with a few caveats. First one, obviously, I am a white guy. I am kind of, in that respect, privileged in this regard. But I am also coming at this from a literature and history background. So I tend to fall back on that training, that experience in looking at this. And that particular literature and history background being predominantly medieval and early modern, with some fantasy and whatnot as well. And occasional rough, brief drops into, what is that thing? Okay. And occasional brief drops into classics and that sort of stuff. So obviously we take a look at the history of the genre. We got a pretty rough start. I have lots of notes here as well, so I will be referring to my notes because that's just, my teaching background and whatnot. So obviously, early parts of the genre, early days of the fantasy genre and whatnot, in terms of what we would call modern fantasy, which I will stop somewhere in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. I'm not going to go back to the classical sources. I'm not going to go back to medieval and all of that sort of thing. Although there are strong medieval roots, the genre does really kind of start off with either the medieval romances or the either the medieval romances or the what the heck is this doing? Go away. Just a second. Something's annoying on my computer. Okay, there we go. Now it's gone. So either the medieval romances, or in some cases people go back to the Greco-Roman myths and whatnot for the Western world. I tend to avoid going back to mythology as a source for fantasy, because everything mythology was at one point practiced faith, practiced religion. They weren't necessarily just stories. They were taken as a source, a part of worship and whatnot. So generally, when I'm looking at the kind of beginning of fantasy, I'm looking at, the medieval, the 12th, 13th century romances, the lays coming out of France, these sorts of things. The legends, the Nordic legends and sagas, those would certainly fall in there as well, of which we have multiple different stages or varieties, all kind of working relatively simultaneously. So we have Norse and Saxon sagas that are coming around the same time as the early romances, that are coming around as the, hey, long time no see. Good to see you, Jenna. Thanks. But also working with some, but anyway, I'm getting distracted as usual. Obviously, when we look at modern fantasy, 20th century and such, we've got some issues with early writers. Happy to have you. When we look at things like Robert Howard or Edgar Rice Burroughs, or the infamous Lovecraft, or Gygax himself in the 70s and such, arguably even Tolkien and various things, we get some really questionable to outright racist foundations in the genre, because they were coming out in mostly the 20s, the 30s, Gygax in the 70s, Lovecraft in the turn of the century to 20s, 30s. These were not necessarily times known for racial equity, shall we say, to put it nicely. But we see this, obviously, as we look through things. We take a look at things like RPG terminology. We take a look particularly like the early days of RPGs. We get things like demi-human race that actually even go up through probably D&D, 4th edition? I guess some of it's still hanging around in 5th to some degree, but we get the idea of demi-human races who are not fully human. We get the idea of monstrous races, all of that sort of stuff. Much as I laugh about dwarf, elf, and halfling being classes back in, basic D&D, way back when, that situation, I think, comes more from the wargaming roots. That's where Gygax was used to describing or trying to describe types of units, rather than necessarily racism as such, which is not to say Gygax did not have a whole bunch of racism in early D&D, because it clearly was there, but that part I don't think was necessarily part of it. Maybe. When we take into account the very, very, very back roots. Orcs in fantasy, obviously a very long-term issue floating around in there. On one hand, we have Tolkien, who really kind of did seem to bring in orcs were kind of stand-ins. There are some definite issues potentially going on there. Could be, I would certainly argue that there's some signs of hidden issues in that regard. In terms of, we take a look at elves throughout most of the gaming world, and we have 20 different varieties of elves floating all over the place. We have 5, 7, 8 different varieties of dwarves running all over. We have one kind of orc. That could be appearance-based. That could also be source material. And yeah, I talk with my hands a lot, so we're going to see that come up a bit. On one hand, we have hundreds of cultures when looking at source material, I'm thinking about source material. We've got hundreds upon hundreds of cultures that have elves or elf-like beings in stories. So there are a lot of different varieties out there in the world. We've got basically Nordic versions, we've got Celtic versions, we've got German versions, we've got Italian versions, we've got we have versions in various Asian cultures, we have versions in various African cultures, we have different types of things we might refer to as elves or fae kind of all over the world in different forms, which of course is also a very vague term to begin with. It's kind of one of those terms we don't really... A lot of things can fall into it, and there are a lot of things may not necessarily be part of it. And then Fae and Demon have had many crossovers and issues and all of that sort of stuff coming into play as well. Because people before the 20th century were not very big on having clear taxonomies and whatnot. Well, before the 19th century, but especially 20th century. It's like most of the terms for magic can be interchangeable pre 20th century, I would say, based on prior research and whatnot. We also have many cultures out there that have dwarf figures, whether we have the kind of murdered the pronunciation, but the Menehune in Hawaii, to the Svartalfar of Scandinavia. Lots of those kind of floating around. And those may also be partially fae or elf, depending. I mean, Svartalfar is literally dark elf or black elf, versus the Ljos Alfar, who were the light elf. The light elves lived with Freyr and Freya in Vanaheim. The Svartalfar lived in the dark because they were dark elves. But we also commonly translate that to dwarf for various reasons. Orcs, on the other hand, don't really have that kind of depth of source material. They basically originate with Tolkien, at least in current conceptions and whatnot. Though the term itself seems to be derived from an Old Norse, Old English term for that basically just was monster or demon in its usual translation, which of course came through Tolkien himself as a Old Norse, Old English expert on linguistic side of things. So there's not really as much rich source material to draw from. That said, even Tolkien provides at least 3 different kinds of orcs running around. We've got the orcs in Gundabad, we got the orcs in Mordor, we got the orcs in Isengard. He tends to use orc and goblin interchangeably, so whenever he uses goblin, orc, that could also mean a different kind of orc. In some ways, Tolkien was very precise about things. In other ways, he was very less so. But there's certainly some issues that have been floating around out there that many, many people have talked about in the past. But one of the big issues that comes up, I think, and this is coming from my perspective looking at things, and this is obviously, as I noted, admittedly very privileged experience in terms of being a white guy, but also looking at things from a literature and history background. I tend to see 3 issues coming up in people's uses of different heritages, lineages in fantasy. And that waving knife, or is that lightsaber? Are those lightsabers or are those knives the ghost guy is carrying there in that gif? That's getting a little distracting, but that's okay. I can ignore it. Maybe. Jenna out here waving knives at me. Or are those lightsabers? Or are those glow sticks? Is that raving ghost face? Okay. Anyway. I think there are 3 big issues that come to mind, at least, when I'm thinking about use of race or heritage in the fantasy genre. One of the big ones that comes to mind is the idea of... Well, they're kind of related ones. Two kind of related ones are the ideas of racial essentialism or biological determinism, which are related concepts, and the idea of cultural appropriation, that masquerading as quote-unquote racial culture. So when we look at racial essentialism or biological determinism, they, at least to my understanding of the terms, which I'm not a sociology background, I've come across the terminology, worked with the terminology a fair bit in terms of literary theory and such, but to my understanding of these ideas, it's basically that the individual is limited by or has their choices determined by their racial, ethnic, or biological characteristics, traits. I would say racial essentialism, to my understanding, would be a subset of biological determinism, because biological determinism could be gender-based or sex-based, could be ethnicity, race-based, could be other things. But racial essentialism would be part of, to my understanding at least, would be a subset of that. In these cases, we see this a lot, more so, I would say, in fantasy gaming than in fantasy as a genre for fiction and whatnot. I'd say it's definitely there to some degree in the fantasy genre, but that it is more prevalent in the gaming side of things. Mostly because we see it in terms of, it's been going away, fortunately, I think, in most cases. We take a look at just the history of D&D. Getting into advanced D&D is the beginning point. So when we look at first edition, we not only had attribute benefit bonuses and penalties that were based on race, but we had class options were limited by race, and there were level limits for each class per race. I don't remember most of those off the top of my head, but I could look it up real quick because I have a copy of the first ed books right here somewhere. Where did we go? Player's Handbook. Cool. Awesome. If this comes up and works properly. This is a digital copy of the original Player's Handbook from 1978. Yeah. Yeah. Take me down here. Give me a... There we go. Not only do we have racial bonuses and penalties for attributes, but there are also limits. So, for example, let's take which are also sex-based limits. So that's all kinds of fun. Let's take a look at where's a good one that shows this quite well. Most of them are plus or minus 1, except we get to the half-orc, for example, who has racial maximum intelligence of 17 out of 18, racial maximum wisdom of 14 out of 18, a racial maximum charisma of 12 out of 18. That these were solid limits for these. We take a look down at the half-orc description. We get, let's see. Yes, we also get them referred to as mongrels, which has got its own issues. Here we go. Half-orc characters have +1 strength and constitution, but must subtract a charisma penalty of -2. Halflings, on the other hand, are, let's see, where did they go? Halflings have some weird stuff going on. Anyway, halflings had a -1 strength, +1 dex, and so on and so forth. And when it came to classes, there were level limits based on race. And I don't remember where that pops up in tables. There are also limits to what classes they could be. So here we go. There we go. So half-orcs. First edition half-orcs were limited to cleric, maximum level 4, fighter, maximum level 10. These are out of 20. plus, or thief maximum level 8. And yeah, whereas humans were unlimited, and I believe this case they went to 29 for levels. So yeah, this definitely had some biological determinism, racial essentialism coming into play. That one carried over into second ed. Although, if I recall correctly, in second ed they wiped out I think they got rid of the class limits in second ed. And of course, by 3.5, they got rid of all of that, and basically, except for there were still racial bonuses and penalties for attributes. Obviously, 5e, 4e, 5e became all pluses, no minuses. They got rid of level limits. They got rid of class limits by race and all that sort of stuff. And then in 5.5, or 2024, whatever we're calling it these days, they also got rid of the attribute modifiers whatsoever from race and attached it to backgrounds, which I think is a better idea. It's got some issues still, but it's still, I think, a better idea than old versions. But basically, biological determinism certainly becomes a big issue. And I think a lot of games have been moving away from that, thankfully, by moving away from things like attributes being tied to heritage or species, moving it toward either no attribute modifiers or generic attribute modifiers everybody gets regardless, or tying it to backgrounds, which makes more sense in some ways. And also removing things like class limits and all of that sort of thing based on racial elements and such. But it does get us into that issue of, which we do sometimes see in the fantasy genre as a whole as well, of elves can only be this way, dwarves can only be this way, gnomes can only be this way, vampires can only be this way, dragons can only be this way, that sort of thing. It also gets us into a similar, somewhat related concept of cultural appropriation that kind of being masquerading as racial culture, where we say this particular people, this particular fantasy race is going to have a generic racial culture. All members of it will have a shared culture that is basically a veiled version of some real-world culture society, or is a thinly veiled version of somebody's stereotypes of a particular real-world culture society. That obviously has a whole bunch of different issues wrapped up into it that come into play. The third one that comes to mind for me as far as issues is tokenism, where we have the token, the token elf, the token dwarf, the token whatever, the token non-human character popping into things. And even that phrase non-human becomes, or terminology non-human kind of becomes a little problematic. But we don't have a term in fantasy like alien, which has its own issues coming into play as well. Or non-terrestrial, extraterrestrial. We don't really have anything like that in the fantasy genre at this point in time that I know of. It would be nice to have language like that beyond non-human, because that gets into hierarchies, racial hierarchies, and all that sort of thing coming into play, which is all kinds of messy, bad stuff coming into play there. But big things to kind of think about. We don't really necessarily want to have the token characters in there for obvious reasons. And those ones I think tend to show up more in the fantasy fiction or fantasy lit than they do in the gaming side of things. I think in the gaming side of things, there is an urge to want to play with various heritages that aren't human, whereas with the lit side of things, I think there's more of we want to show people wanting to show what all is going on in the world. which tends to then create some token, some Star Wars Mos Eisley Cantina type scenes, where we have a whole bunch of different little one or two people from different heritages or alien races or whatnot in the background that nobody really knows much about or sees much about. Which is not necessarily a bad move in some respects. It can be good to bring. That can be a good way to bring into show kind of what's going on, what's possible with backgrounds and whatnot, or background characters and whatnot, background descriptions and things. But we do want to watch out for, I think, and it can easily devolve into the idea of, oh, I haven't put in a dwarf here, I need to throw one in there. Oh, I haven't put in an orc here, I need to throw one in, or things along those lines. Which can be obviously problematic for the same reasons that tokenism is problematic with real world races, etc. Races, orientations, backgrounds, whatever it happens to be. So I think for me, those are the three big issues. Again, from a very kind of privileged but very lit/history background look at things. The idea is that we've got biological determinism coming into play. We've got the appropriation coming into play. We've got tokenism as a potential thing that may come into play. And these are a lot of reasons. These three are a lot of reasons that various people, particularly I want to say N.K. Jemisin, and I had a bunch of others that I had quoted somewhere. A number of others used or stated. Let me check I've got a research links page here because I was looking at doing a potential book with this at some point in time. Yeah, Jemisin was a big one. And a whole bunch of other people have written a whole bunch of stuff about this. Public Medievalist online has written about this to some degree. Alex Reisman has written about this to some degree. A whole bunch of people online have talked about some of these issues. And one of the big ones they bring up, or one of the big ones that Jemisin in particular brings up, is in her, let's see, where was it? What was her piece? It was, I have lost the exact article name, but is that she doesn't like using, or doesn't see the appeal to using other races, other species, lineages, because of what they have been used for in the past and how they have been used in the past. And that doesn't necessarily work with her. In fact, there was a piece that I found a while back. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Yes, this one. Let me see what this comes up as, who this was written by. Public Medieval, a site, Public Medievalist, had the piece, Paul Sturtevant, had a piece entitled Race, the Original Sin of the Fantasy Genre, which makes some degree of sense, or has a lot of background to it and a lot of discussion with it, referencing particularly Helen Young, who had a book called, where is this from? A book from Rutledge University Press, titled Race and Popular Fantasy Literature, referencing various AD&D and all of that, and all the way through 5th edition, referencing Drist from and the Drow in general, in early D&D and whatnot, Forgotten Realms and such, all of that sort of stuff, and some of the language and whatnot that's heavily used by things. Also referencing briefly the first D&D episode on the show Community, with Senor Chang cosplaying as a drow. That is actually ignored by Netflix. Netflix refuses it, has not shown it, and pretends it doesn't exist, which is kind of interesting, or an interesting choice. But we do have these issues kind of coming into play, I think. However, and they're certainly very good issues and very good reasons for avoiding or not using concepts of races beyond humanity in different worlds. Certainly understandable reasons. However, I think there are some good things about using different races, heritages, lineages beyond human in different worlds. So, on one hand, I'm going to go probably in an order of... How do I want to approach that? Let's take the... I think a couple different reasons. I think there are reasons why we use them, reasons why we tend to be drawn to them. I think there are also reasons where ways to do things well. Used well, other than human races in fantasy, can be helpful and useful for addressing a lot of socio-political issues, which is what which people have been doing for a couple decades, a few decades now. I'd say even back into the 80s and even possibly the 70s. Using elves and dwarves and halflings and goblins and orcs and dragons and that sort of thing to discuss political systems or social issues or other concerns of those sorts can be somewhat easier if they're in that form versus if they're human. That can be possibly not as difficult and can be possibly less triggering to audiences to do that. I think a really good example of that is Terry Pratchett in the Discworld series, where he addresses a huge amount of socio-political, cultural issues, but he does so with, dwarves and trolls and Igors and Nobses, the one Nobs, and orcs and gnomes and the wee free men and a whole bunch of and vampires and werewolves and all sorts of other things, and he uses them to, as well as the human characters and whatnot, to do a whole bunch of stuff. Hey, Jack, how's it going? Good drink time. I've just been talking about some of the issues that come into play. Yep, Jenna's floating around here a little bit, lurking and stuff, and waving. I'm still figuring out if those are glow sticks or knives or lightsabers. I was just kind of talking about some of the issues and things, some of the background of issues with, very, very briefly, with race and fantasy and whatnot. Things like biological determinism, tokenism, cultural appropriation, all that fun stuff. Yeah, I think they are kind of glow knives. And kind of a little bit of background history of issues with, Robert Howard and Burroughs and Lovecraft and Gygax and all that fun stuff. But moving into where I think are good things. And I think one of the good things, I was just mentioning, I think one of the good things is that it is a nice way, it can be a good, less triggering way to talk about social and political issues. Particularly, I think I was saying using Terry Pratchett is a great example of that, with all of his cultural and social satire, dressed up with dwarves and trolls and vampires and werewolves and all those other fun and Igors and all that stuff. To various forms, yeah. What else did I bring in? So I think on one hand, there's that level of being kind of easier to deal with some things in that regard, less triggering in some respects. I know N.K. Jemisin, for example, disagrees in one of her statements about why she will not use non other than human characters. Yes, yep, yeah, I do recall her floating around. Wasn't she played by? Who the heck was she played by in the movie? I remember I was pretty sure she was in one of the movies, wasn't she? I don't remember who played her. She stands out in mind, but I can't remember who the actress was for that one. Back with one of the early Schwarzenegger ones, and I've got a mental picture, but I can't think of who the actor was offhand. Yeah, there was Grace Jones. Yes, that's who I was thinking of. I was thinking of Grace Jones. Yeah. Maybe a different character. It's been a long time. Looking at positive things. Okay, different character. Okay. So I think there is that social political thing. It's easy to make use of. Definitely ties in. Pratchett's a really great example of this. Other folks have done it. China Mieville has done a fair bit of that with the Khepri and whatnot in New Crobuzon in Perdido Street Station and such. Though he's more of a steampunk setup in the genre, steampunk fantasy. I think on one level, obviously we've got the history going back to that all of these, since so many of our sort of standard, quote unquote, standard fantasy races, heritages come from various bits of folklore, mythology, legend, romances, all that stuff. There's definitely in the sort of precursors to the fantasy genre across different cultures, there's definitely, I think, an urge on the part of creators, whether they be authors or gamers or whatnot, to sort of play with these figures, these different peoples that we've kind of grown up with, and that we've kind of seen in these stories, to maybe kind of update them in various ways, to play with them in different ways, to kind of make new adaptations, find new adaptations for them, or even to use the old forms just to kind of, in some ways, maybe link ourselves to the tradition, to the sort of to the past and whatnot. I think a lot of us get into, for example, gaming because of an interest in fantasy, because of an interest in mythology. And I think there's a certain desire in many of us in that regard to play with the things we find in the myths, to play with the things we find in the legends. Who wouldn't want to run around with who wouldn't want to run around with Excalibur or the Golden Fleece or whatnot, or an equivalent to it in various forms. There's the thing going around these days about in the memes about what was it? When I was 10, the wrapping paper roll was a sword. When I was 40, the wrapping paper wrapping paper roll was a sword. We kind of have this kind of, in a lot of cases, kind of wired in. Nice. Goblin folk as being. Yeah, definitely. I think that's biological determinism. I think is a really big one that we got to watch out for. Predominantly, I think on the gaming side, even more so than the literature side. Just because in gaming side we have that urge to give things stats, and I think when we give things stats, we're getting closer. We have that when we give other than human beings stats, we start getting into that, getting toward that biological determinism, racial essentialism, that sort of thing. Whereas when it's, I think, a little less common to some degree in fiction literature, especially these days. I mean, obviously Tolkien had a certain amount of it. Orcs were bad no matter what. Elves were good no matter what, more or less, with maybe a couple exceptions in the Silmarillion. But whereas gaming, I mean, I looked at, for example, first edition D&D, where we had orcs get +1 strength and con -2 charisma. Orcs are limited to being clerics, max level 4, fighters, max level 10, or thieves, max level 5, or 8. And that was basically it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, depending on which of Tolkien's explanations we take a look at, which of his many explanations and whatnot. I think the point there being more that determinism of, we don't have any good orcs, we don't have any bad elves, that sort of thing. Yeah, he definitely had issues across there with that one, figuring that out, and the whole orc and goblin being interchangeable terms and all of that sort of stuff, and how he worked things, and yeah. All kinds of stuff going on there. Beyond the playing with things and kind of being the precursors, I think one reason that we do keep them in is definitely as precursors, because they are there in the things that were kind of the earliest days of the there's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of articles out there on all different aspects of that issue. That was one of the fun parts of when was it? I only managed to get to one medieval conference during my time in grad school, and there were like it was the big medieval conference. It's in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and there were 7 or 8 sessions devoted to Tolkien, which would be about 24 papers people were delivering on various aspects, from the linguistic sides of things and his work as a linguist to Middle Earth and whatnot. So there was a heck of a lot of stuff out there, a heck of a lot of stuff with that. There's an entire academic journal devoted to him, basically, as well. It's not a very big one, but it's definitely out there. Actually, somebody you may have come across, but might be interested in with him is I'm going to put the name in here because I will probably murder the pronunciation, but it's Verlin. Let me double check the spelling real quick once I knock myself out of that chair. Where is he? Where are you, buddy? F-L-I-E. Okay, F-L-I-E-G-E-R. Verlin Flieger, who I just put in chat, he's got a bunch of, he has a ton of books looking at various aspects of rings and whatnot. He basically built his academic career on looking at Tolkien, particularly rings and the kind of even down to the level of world building and the kind of underlying assumptions and whatnot that came into things. He's got a heck of a lot of stuff out there with that. Yeah, I did note kind of earlier in stream, I did kind of note that while technically we can probably argue myths as being a foundation of the fantasy genre, I tend to steer away from that just because of the religious aspect to mythology, leaning instead toward the medieval romances, sagas, the French lays, the Breton lays rather, and legends as being more of a root, because they don't have the mythology, the religious aspect to it, because they were not necessarily believed as actual or that sort of thing. But we still see a lot of the same roots. So we get the elves, we get the shapeshifters. Marie de France has a collection of lays with various shape-shifting figures. You got a werewolf in there. You got a hawk shifter who is probably Fae. Chrétien of Troy, or de Troy, has what the heck is it? It's which one is it? It is not Lancelot. It's Knight of the Cart. Yvain, Knight of the Cart, that has where the knight, the Arthurian knight from the Round Table, finds, as he is trying to elude capture in a place he wasn't supposed to be, a strange little gold ring that when he puts on, he turns invisible. And is thereby able to hide underneath the bench and not be seen and not be kicked and all that good stuff. That sounds rather familiar and things. And of course, giants and all that sort of thing, giants and dragons and all that. We've got Beowulf and we've got the various romances and all that sort of thing. Yeah. To various things, the various forms, some cases. To some cases, other cases they're a little newer in many respects. I would say, actually, rather than saying euphemisms, I would say that they have what would I call it? It would be I was just talking with my classes about this a week ago, and I'm totally blanking on it now. Illusions. In some respects, depending on which lay we're dealing with and which romance and which all of that fun stuff. But even if they're even referring back to various things, I would argue that they don't have the religious cachet that like mythology does and whatnot. To some degree. In some of the cases, in other cases, Marie, for example, doesn't really seem to have a whole lot in that regard. Her stories are rather more seem to come out of folk tales than anything else in some cases. But there's a whole mess of directions that can go down to. Where was I going? I'm totally blanking again. Yeah, the things. Yeah, to some degree. Folk tales. I would say there's. So I would argue there is a line between folktale and mythology. In that, I would say mythology tends to, and this is obviously a difficult thing, but I tend to say there are differences between mythology, folktale, legend, that they do have differences to them. But what those differences are tend to be malleable, or what was the word I would use? They tend to have borders that are permeable. The difference, I would say, would be things like, for example, Hansel and Gretel, I would say, is not, while it may have some relations to prior myths or whatnot, did not have the religious belief aspect to it that, say, the story of Prometheus does. And it's kind of a fine line, but in some cases, but yes, there are certainly resemblances too. But again, they don't necessarily have the same. They don't have the same thing of practiced belief to them necessarily. Practiced religious belief, that is, to them. And there's even some argument in those cases as well, but I don't really want to go that direction right now, mentally. So on one level, kind of circling back a little bit, I think we get good use in terms of Yes, definitely. There are shifts, there are changes, there are modified ideas, and that sort of thing. Um, they shift from being, yeah, they shift from being something that is goes from a religious belief into being something that is a cautionary tale, into something that becomes a cultural or a social standards sort of tale. And yeah, a lot of mythology kind of falls into that as well. But yeah, um, circling that kind of back around a little bit, I think beyond the idea of social political issues, beyond the kind of precursors thing, another good use that we have, I think, a reason we bring in a lot of these peoples and races and whatnot into heritages, whatever, into fantasy, whether gaming or lit, goes back to or is similar to basically is in many respects. I think fantasy's version of sci-fi's Are We Alone in the Universe? And not necessarily wanting to be alone in the universe to some degree. I would say when we look at things like folklore, myth, legend, fairy tale, part of why we have these entities, these other than human beings in them, are one, obviously we've got control over culture, control over the world rather, or explanations for things going on in the world. For when we talk about gods and demigods and all that stuff in mythology or whatnot, when we talk about various things in, centaurs and satyrs and kynocephali and all of these sorts of things. I think there's part of the kind of desire not to be alone as a species that we kind of have, that desire to, that realization of there's a lot of space here, whether that space be physically in the world or as the world becomes more crowded, the thank you, as the world becomes more crowded, yes, I mean, definitely we have interpreting phenomena as a result of agency, but I think we've also got this thing of when we are small little groups, we know there's a lot more land out there, and we don't want to be alone in that big, huge amount of land. As we get bigger and there get be more people, we find out there's more land, and then there's more land, and there's more land, and okay, we found all the land. Now we have all this other space, and space is obviously much more. The galaxy, the universe is obviously much huger, and so no matter how we go progressively in terms of population or in terms of technology or whatnot, we still are finding that we are a small bit in a large space. And I think there is something kind of inherent to us that doesn't want to be alone in that, that wants to have other things, other beings out there. I mean, obviously, we do have some issues. We do have some theological issues with that, with particularly the Abrahamic faiths. But I think there's still that kind of underlying, and the whole being made in God's image and all that stuff. But I think there is still that kind of underlying desire to not be alone, as we realize kind of how small we are in comparison to everything else out there. And I think fantasy is a good way to, well, yes, I will, as a Catholic school survivor, I will also keep my general opinion on the Abrahamic stuff to myself, for these purposes at least. But I think we do kind of keep coming back to these. We keep coming back to this idea of elves. We keep coming back to this idea of dwarves. We keep coming back to this idea of, the centaurs, kynocephali. That there are other there are other things out there. On one hand, sure, there's othering of the strange or the weird, but I think there's also a lot of, we don't necessarily, even as we're kind of concerned about what might be out there, we also kind of don't want to be the only ones there, to some regard. I think, I don't remember who it was that said a while back, it may have been a movie. It was probably a movie, that was something about if we're the only ones out there, then it's an awful waste of space. I think that was a movie somewhere, but I can't remember which one now because it was probably when I was in my teens, which was like 30 years ago. Anyway, so for me, when I'm looking at bringing other peoples in, I think we do have these three good reasons. I think we can address socio-political issues in a non-triggering way. We call back to those precursors, those things we grew up with, those things that got us interested in fantasy to some degree, or that we got interested in because of fantasy, to kind of play with. And this kind of need not to, or desire not to be alone in everything, in creation, whatnot, in existence, the universe, the world, whatever it happens to be. And yeah, I'm kind of talking with my hands again, as I'm noticing on my side screen here. But for me, looking at things, I really try to kind of see it as sort of a balancing act between my desire to play with these neat things from mythology and folklore, or things that come to my own kind of thoughts, my own kind of creations or hybridizations of things, in terms of races, heritages, while not kind of recapitulating or redoing all of the kind of problematic aspects that come into play. So a few things I've done to deal with that, to kind of help myself deal with that, I hope, are not associating, alignment with different lineages, heritages, races, which also goes back to my kind of personal view of inherent good, inherent evil kind of ideas. And I know, Jack, you said you had something about it. You had a previous YouTube or stream or YouTube thing regarding, quote unquote, evil races and whatnot in gaming. I think that's definitely something that I tend to try to avoid personally, and good or evil species, races, whatever. I think in large part because of my own kind of views on the subject. I think when I was younger, I was definitely dumping alignment, except for pretty much dumped alignment, specifically for purely supernatural demons, devils. Yeah, I think that's definitely a good route to go. That's definitely where I try to go, and I think part of that is I tend to see things more as gray, and I don't necessarily. I've had issues with alignment as a general concept in gaming since probably high school, which was like 30-ish years ago. Even a little bit further back, possibly. But so I have issues with saying, this, for lack of a better example off the top of my head, orcs are all bad, elves are all good, sort of thing. I definitely have kind of issues with bringing that in. So I definitely don't kind of try to avoid associating that sort of thing. I've kind of gotten rid of, in my own thinking, I've gotten rid of the old gaming terms of, demi-human or monstrous races, that sort of thing. Monster I tend to reuse to refer to generally not, well, I don't know, I tend to use it kind of in weird ways. Yeah, exactly. One version of orcs that are literal demons, but biological creatures not working out. Yeah, exactly. I think that's the route I definitely go with. I'm trying to get better about reading things. And side note, I'm trying to get better about reading things in chat so that when this goes on YouTube or whatnot, if it goes on YouTube, it's not half a conversation that disappears. I'm trying to get better about that. So I try to avoid that. I've consciously moved myself to discussing lineages and heritages in terms of tendencies rather than absolutes. Yes. But I've kind of shifted toward, say, physical or psychological or social tendencies rather than absolutes when I'm talking about heritages, lineages, races, whatever you want to put it. So rather than saying, minotaurs are big, tall, buff, bullheaded things. Okay, yeah, they tend to go this route, but aren't necessarily all that way, or there's a tendency toward this. I think that gives us that wiggle room and tries to move us away. Yes, only the Sith deal in absolutes, which itself is an absolute, which I've always had issues with Kenobi for, but or rather with whichever the writer was for that one. So I kind of move towards that tendencies of saying this is generally how things might go, or what a general preference might be when it comes to like kind of social sides of things or whatnot, which I think leaves us room to avoid determinism and whatnot in there. Kind of writing it into things rather than kind of just having a little bit of throwing it out there. I also generally try to focus more on cultural impact versus racial impact in terms of things like character names, character kind of voice, character tendencies, that sort of thing. While acknowledging that, lineage and culture interact, and lineage-based subcultures will exist within a society and whatnot. But that, say, I'm going to mess with this a little bit to some degree. The reinforcing in text in my kind of creation level or trying to reinforce in myself mentally and whatnot in terms of naming and other things along these lines that say I'll use Forgotten Realms. Dwarves of the Icewind Dale area are going to be different than dwarves in Waterdeep, are going to be different than dwarven cultures in, Moonshae. Not that there are necessarily ones over there. I don't remember. My Forgotten Realms lore is all kinds of wonky. I was never really big on them anyway, but they had nations I could remember better. Environment shapes culture, definitely. That the dwarves who grew up around a predominantly human culture of, say, Waterdeep are going to be different than those who grew up around a predominantly dwarven culture of, say, Icewind Dale, Bruenor, all that stuff. I think a really good example of that is, I'm going to go back to Terry Pratchett. He does a really good job, I think, discussing some of those differences and how culture and environment shape and change based on where people are at. He does that through, the book that comes to mind immediately for that is, what was the one? It was Thud. Thud is one that comes to mind immediately for that, with the exclamation point, in which he has all the ones with carrot, definitely. I think Thud really comes to mind, though, when we've got like you have the deep dwarf, the dwarves of the mountains of the various, the copper and all that stuff versus the dwarves in town, and that one really stands out for me as a spot where the Ankh-Morpork dwarves and the dwarves of the old countries are really having the cultural clash, or the culture clash going on. Same with the trolls. In those cases, the city trolls, where you've got brick versus the old country trolls, and there's that culture clash kind of going into play in those cases. Obviously, any of the ones with the trolls in Ankh-Morpork are going to have some of that between the Brecca and some of the adaptations to having, Blue John and Detritus and whatnot. Same with all the dwarf ones, anyone's involving carrot, certainly. But I think that one, Thud especially, really kind of... Thud and really Fifth Elephant as well, I think really kind of are standout ones for really harping on these changes and these differences. Particularly with Constable Cheery and or Sherry and and the deep down dwarves and all of that stuff. And that they're really, really great with those. Yeah, culture and gender, yeah, definitely big ones coming in there. I think those ones were really good for showing the whole environment changing, culture and shifting, and that the subculture idea coming into play as well, and the subculture within the heritage or lineage or race-based subculture within the culture, but that was very different from the the old world culture and that sort of thing. I think it was really kind of huge with that. The Igors definitely fall into that, and how the Igors shift and change. Even Angua and the werewolf shift and change in there, or adaptation to different Angua versus her family. Definitely showing that culture, those kind of adaptations and shifts and whatnot. But I think it's most particularly strong with the dwarves and the trolls, yeah, with those ones. I had not watched that. So when the Watch show made Cheery a non-binary human because it was a gender struggle, yeah, definitely big issues there. I had lots of hopes for the show. I had lots and lots of hopes for the Watch show. The casting looked great, even with I think they had one or two gender swaps in there, but that was fun. I was cool with that. They looked great, but then I started seeing stuff coming out about it after the first episode from Pratchett fans I trust, and was like, nope, not going to bother. And I think one of the big ones people really, yeah, Terry's daughter was not happy with. Yeah. A lot of folks I know who were really huge Pratchett people whose opinions I greatly trust on that were just really not happy. Yeah, definitely switching Sybil. Sybil's size is so much size and age are so much a part of the character that changing that around is just not, totally loses the character on so many levels. But yeah, so that one was, yeah, it's definitely that she is, yeah, it's definitely that her size, her on one hand, the kind of mix of, yeah, the size, the age are definitely major important things there. Yeah, as well as yeah, definitely her dress like I want. Yeah, I'm going to show up to the social. Well, at least early on, I'm going to show up to the social event in my dragon handling stuff, and all those fun things. Combined with that sheer air of, how do I put it, the Ramkin attitude of competence and ignoring things that don't, ignoring dangers that are going on around, sort of thing, to continue, serving tea as the fortress falls, and that, or as the fortress is being attacked and whatnot. All of those things definitely coming into play, definitely important for her. Yeah, I was going to watch that. I was really excited about it, and then started seeing more about it. And like I said, people who I really kind of, whose opinions on Pratchett I really respected and whatnot, because I know how big they are as fans, were seeing a couple episodes in, and I think there was also like taking out Detritus in the first episode or second episode, in some very dumb, very easy fashion. Rather than treating him as an actual troll, purportedly because the effects were too expensive or something like that, rather than walking him off to the side or something along those lines, was probably not a great decision either. So yeah, definitely, I think those are definitely really big ways. And I think Pratchett's a really great example of showing things to aspire to in terms of how we look at this idea of other than human peoples, and how culture effects and culture and social things affect and subcultures come into play. I think honestly, in general, his writing, his world building, his as much as his early world building was very C.S. Lewis-ish of tossing stuff together. His later world building, definitely getting into the and his storytelling and whatnot, I think are definitely things to aspire to. But certainly his I think approach to using and adopting different races, heritages, lineages is a kind of an exemplar to take a look at for anyone really. There was a wonderful piece that I looked at when I don't know if I was working on, it may have been dissertation, where basically he's very good at all of the subcultures in the society. Ankh-Morpork being the perfect example, where we've got all the different kind of racial subcultures. We've got the watch subculture, the university subculture, all of that sort of stuff that he's very, very good at, or was very good at working with, the guild subcultures and such. How they put it, it was the anytime that he wants to introduce a new race, it appears in the watch and becomes accepted in the watch, and then they start appearing all over the city after that. And I think that's a really great example or demonstration of introducing new characters, new heritages, new races into worlds. Is kind of that he's kind of a masterclass in doing that, in terms of saying, we're going to introduce one character of this, we're going to kind of bring them into the watch, we're going to have them show up in somebody else's story for a little bit as a second tier character, then we'll make them a primary character either elsewhere in the city or still in the watch or close to a primary, or put them in the ensemble cast as a major role in the ensemble cast, and then bring more and more of them into the more and more dwarves and more trolls and more whatever Igors, whatever it happens to be, into things after we have that kind of initial one in the city. It's a great way to even particularly for things like D&D campaigns or any RPG campaigns or whatnot, where we say, okay, I come across this new thing that was in this new source book that came out, or new world book that came out. I want to incorporate. I really like it. I want to incorporate it into this world, this ongoing campaign. How can we do that? Excuse me. I think he's a great example of kind of showing how we can kind of work those in various ways as well, in a way that is kind of smooth and flows well and all of that stuff. That's going to hit the majority of my notes. I had some other stuff, but I could talk about today, or I could wait till tomorrow, because I've got some extra time this week. I did have a bunch of stuff. What the heck do I still have these for? I don't need those open. Those are just in the way. I got a bunch of stuff about different uses and origins of different fantasy peoples, races, whatnot, that I put together a while back that I could certainly go off on for a while. Or I may hold off on that and do something with that tomorrow. I don't know. Any tangents? Any tangents or related stuff from chat? I'm happy to sit here for a while and just kind of talk about whatever for a bit. Revisit things on the sometime tomorrow. Ooh, what's going on there? Okay, cool. Ah, yes. Yeah, I got a good chunk of writing out of the way yesterday. Got a little bit more started today. I actually took that, I've taken that trees thing I talked about a week or two back, a couple weeks back maybe, that you were on stream with, or in chat with, Jack. And I actually am not building. I've changed directions with it. I've shifted from doing a world around it to incorporating it in as a nice. Currently finishing up Mutants Mastermind's version of Modi Thorson. Okay, cool. As super villain. Okay, yeah, cool, nice. What I've taken it out of building a world itself. Decided that wasn't really the direction I wanted to go with it, although it had interesting potential. And I've shifted around to reworking the basic idea. Nice. Middle kid gets ignored, decides to take the Jotun side. Nice. Sounds fun. Decided to take the idea with the 7 to 9 different magic trees, sacred trees, based off of different mythological, etc. ones. And I need to make a copy of this somewhere else. Don't want to lose this real quick. Trying to multitask, do multiple things at once here. Once I figure out remember where I put this thing. Where was this? Crud. There, because I was going to do a book with that. Yes, that's right. And decided to turn it into a sort of, still keeping it as part of the Junction multiverse I've been working on, but take a different route with it. So basically what I've done in the multiverse, I've divided up places in the multiverse, or planes, if you will, to worlds that are basically self-contained. Well, they're all technically self-contained, but worlds that are there, and then what we call maybe physical plane or material plane, and realms, which are places that touch all the different worlds. So in the realms, we got a shadow realm, we got God's home, we've got or God's homes. We've got the gray realm, which is more of a spirit realm, elemental realms, that sort of thing. So I decided instead to take those trees, rather than having them as part of a particular world, and make them into a weird place, sort of a grove of that is kind of a realm, but not quite, that sometimes that can manifest in whole or in part on different worlds and different realms. So you make it one tree that falls into a particular world, or you make it the entire grove of 7 to 9. There's debate. And it also can occasionally manifest itself in the Junction, which is the place where all of the various buildings and things, structures that appear on multiple worlds or can manifest on multiple worlds, kind of have their primary existence. So it's only a couple acres in size, so it's not really a realm as such, like an elemental realm, but it's kind of a quasi-realm, or kind of almost a pocket realm, but it's not but a naturally occurring one. With a variety of trees, I think I did changes and trees of changes, death, doors. Doors would also be your kind of world tree setup, life, knowledge, jewels, aka money tree, aka tree of stars, prophecy, because I started channeling things like the Grove of Dodona and all of that stuff from Greek mythology. What was the other one I brought? There were potentially 2 others. Time, which there's argument about whether the Tree of Prophecy and the Tree of Time are the same thing, or whether they're separate. I'm building them as separate, but there's still discussion they could be the same thing, and thus the Tree of Prophecy is prophecy because it's a Tree of Time. And last but not least, the debating whether people debating whether it actually exists, wishing tree, which is something I kind of stumbled upon while looking up other trees, as a kind of elusive tree that grants wishes. In this case, the tree actively will move itself around and conceal itself and all that fun stuff. So I'm kind of taking a different route with it, but still kind of having it as part of things because I really like the idea. So yeah, wrapped up yesterday. First drafts on the Fairlands stuff. Go over to the site real quick and see what all I've got there actually. So I wrapped up the Fairlands stuff yesterday. I managed to have a good chunk of writing time in the morning and such when I was home more or less alone because kid was sick. Kid was homeschool sick, but he was or home from school sick, but he was not doing a whole lot aside from sleeping or working on some gifts he's making for people. Holiday gifts he's making for people. I wrapped up that one, getting the first draft of the Undying Kingdoms together. So the Fairlands are basically settled for first draft. There's stuff to tweak and polish as always, but what else? So I've got about 60 or 70 pages of notes for the one Avendor setting to type up, which I'm going to probably start doing tomorrow. And I started working on writing up some stuff with the Grove, or adapting Grove, this morning. Kind of a little more narrative intro to it, and then breaking down the individual trees after that. And then I think what's left after that? I think after that is I've got to expand that Rayrick, the secret societies of librarians and summoners and tea blenders and innkeepers. When I want to expand that out, so that's on my list. And I've got one other thing that came to mind that I was playing with, thanks to, in part, to actually Mare, when she was doing a stream, chatting and a chatting and game stream with Sean, Help Action Needed, Kairos, for Castleton the other day, and something that she was talking about spawned some things on me. I did some quick notes for that I may make use of at some point in time. So all those weird things people say something and a new idea for something pops into my head, because that never happens to anybody, right? Totally not uncommon, because there's so many. The writing to-do list keeps getting things taken off, but then for every one thing that goes off, two more things get added. Yeah, I think that's where I'm at the moment. I think I've got some stuff put together as far as some note stuff about some variants and fun things with different kind of beings that have kind of become somewhat cliche, or races, heritages that have kind of got different weird backgrounds and become kind of cliche. But I think, since I've only got about half an hour or so before I get some stuff done, because I got to run off and pick up the kid from school, I think I'm going to hold off on that, because I've got, holy crud, I've got 10 pages of single-spaced notes on that sort of stuff. So I think I'm going to hold off on that, because that one I can fill an hour or 2 hours with easy. So much stuff. There was a time when I did a massively huge blog posts. Yeah. Unfortunately, those things like prior commitments and house stuff kind of gets in the way of all the fun things. Dishes won't do themselves as much as I would hope that they would, and all that fun stuff. Cats won't take care of themselves. Still got a flea pill, 2 cats, and all the fun that is. Which means I may need to get out my armor, or what little pieces of armor I have. I think I'm gonna kind of wrap up here then. In that case, I could go off on some tangents. I could wander some tangents, but since I'm not sure where I want to at the moment, so I think I'm gonna go ahead and maybe wind down a little bit. Unless anything comes to mind on the side or pops into heads briefly. But since everybody's working, it's probably not going to be the case. Nope. Okay, cool. No extra brain. Yeah, exactly. It's definitely, yeah, it's around that time. We finished up, let's see, we finished up classes last Friday. My last day was last Wednesday for classes and tutoring. Grades were due yesterday, but I got them in, wanted to get them in Saturday because of other things that were going on, family stuff and everything that was going on. So yeah, brain kind of, this was the last couple of days have just been kind of, and then sick kid yesterday, just kind of everything's been kind of gone kind of for the most part. But on that note, I'll kind of wrap up here. I see a few people who are floating around here. We got somebody playing Terraria, and I got Robert on. So I think what I'll probably do is I'll give my little kind of closing spiel before I forget it, because I'm trying to remember it and trying to use it, beginning and end. So I think everybody here actually is Eastern time zone at the moment. So I will just say good afternoon to everyone. I'm Brent, an author, amateur world builder, writing educator. You can find me as, actually you already found me, but for everyone who is not on chat, you can find me as werewolf-dr on Threads, Instagram, Patreon, Ko-Fi, and YouTube, as well as here, and werewolf-dr at Bluesky. And links are up in the chat, and if this gets to YouTube, I will put all the links in the description, or I will try to remember to do that, because sometimes I forget. And I think, let's see, Kaylin has one person playing Terraria. I don't know what that is, but she's only got one person. So, or there's Robert. I don't know if Robert is live or not at the moment. Let's see if Robert is live or if this is a recorded. Okay, there is no... That looks like that's probably recorded. Okay, I'm gonna, in that case, since he's got 81 people on there, I'm gonna go bump over to the person on my list who only has one, to give them a little bit of boost, at least temporarily. How about the small folks? Let's see, manager. Do this. I always forget. Nope, not there. Not there. There, that's what I'm looking for. And let's go for this. Why not? Bounce over to Kaylin57, who only has one person at the moment, just to kind of help out somebody with another small stream. And we'll see how that goes.
Well, of course there's D&D characters keep, huh?
Oh, Dr. Werewolf Doctor is raiding with 3 of 3. Thanks for the raid.